The termination letter was already signed and sealed when Hector Navarro walked out of Meridian Financial's downtown Toronto office for the last time, carrying nothing but a worn canvas bag and the small dinosaur thermos his 8-year-old son had packed with lukewarm hot chocolate that morning, insisting his dad would need it. Behind him, the glass doors slid shut without ceremony. Colleagues watched from behind computer screens and said nothing. A few looked away. One manager, the one who had handed him the envelope without making eye contact, was already on another call before Hector reached the elevator. Outside, Bay Street moved the way it always does, fast, indifferent. November wind cut between the towers and pushed an empty coffee cup across the sidewalk. Hector stood there for a moment, thermos in hand, watching the cup tumble until it disappeared into a storm drain. He didn't cry, he just started walking. If you believe that doing the right thing eventually finds its way back to you, stay with this story. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if Resilience Tales is new to you, subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of story we're here to tell. Hector Navarro had spent 14 years building something he was never allowed to put his name on. He had joined Meridian Financial straight out of university, back when the firm was still a mid-sized wealth management company with 40 employees and a leaking ceiling in the break room. He was 24 years old, the son of a retired pipefitter from Hamilton and a school librarian who had sacrificed every spare dollar to put him through school. He understood numbers the way some people understand people, instinctively, quietly, without needing to announce it. Over the years, the models he built quietly became the backbone of the firm's risk assessment division. Algorithms he stayed late to refine were presented at board meetings by people 2 pay grades above him. Reports he authored were circulated under other people's names. He didn't complain. He told himself this was simply how things worked, that patience was a form of integrity, and that eventually the right person would notice. What Hector hadn't accounted for was how much life could change while he was being patient. His wife, Renata, no, not that name. Her name was Soline. Soline Navarro, born in Montreal to a Haitian father and a Quebecoise mother, who laughed too loudly in restaurants, and kept a running list of birds she spotted from their kitchen window in Scarborough. Soline died of a brain aneurysm on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 4 years before this story begins. She was 38 years old. She had been standing in line at a pharmacy when it happened. The paramedics said she was gone before she reached the floor. Their son, Mateo, was 4 at the time. Hector does not talk about those first months easily, even now. What's documented is this. He took 3 weeks of bereavement leave, returned to work, and did not take another sick day for 2 years. He hired a daycare, then a babysitter, then a second babysitter when the first one moved away. He learned to make Soline's black bean soup from memory, after Mateo refused to eat anyone else's version. He braided his son's hair badly for 18 months, using YouTube videos, rewinding the same tutorial over and over at 11 o'clock at night. Until one morning Mateo finally said, "That actually looks okay, Dad." He held it together the way certain men do, quietly, completely, and at enormous personal cost. The cost at work was different but just as real. He had started arriving slightly later. Not late, not in violation of anything. But no longer the first one in the building, no longer the one who answered emails at 6 in the morning. When his son's school called because Mateo had a fever, Hector left. When there was a parent-teacher meeting, he went. When his manager scheduled a monetary team sync on a Friday at 4:30, Hector sometimes, not always, but sometimes, said he couldn't make it. These things were noted, not out loud, not on any formal document, but they were noted. When the layoffs came, Meridian had overexpanded, brought in consultants who recommended strategic restructuring, which is a phrase that means firing people. Hector's name appeared on the list. His manager called it a difficult decision. The HR representative offered a folder of resources. The termination letter used the word "unfortunately" 4 times. Hector had heard of the layoffs 2 weeks before his own came. A colleague had warned him in the elevator, speaking quietly, eyes on the floor numbers. He could have made noise, called in favors, reminded people what he'd built. He didn't. He went home that evening, helped Mateo with a science project about the water cycle, made pasta with the jarred sauce his son preferred, and said nothing. Some people call that dignity. Some call it defeat. The truth is usually somewhere in between. On the day the letter came, he took the bus home because his car needed a repair he'd been putting off for 2 months. It was raining steadily in that particular Toronto way, not dramatic, just persistently gray. Mateo was at school. The apartment was quiet in a way that apartments only are at 2 in the afternoon on a weekday when something has gone wrong. Hector sat at the kitchen table, still in his coat, and opened his son's thermos. The hot chocolate was cold. He drank it anyway. The weeks that followed had a different texture than the years before. For the first time in Mateo's life, Hector was there when the school bus arrived. He stood at the end of their street every afternoon, hands in his jacket pockets, and when the doors opened, and his son stepped off with his oversized backpack, and that particular expression of mild suspicion that 8-year-olds carry around like a second lunchbox, Hector was there. The first afternoon, Mateo looked confused. "Did something happen?" he asked. "I changed jobs," Hector said. "To what job? I'll figure that out. How was school?" Mateo squinted at him for a long moment, the way kids do when they're deciding whether an adult is being honest. Then he started telling him about a disagreement at lunch, involving a trading card and a broken promise, and the moment passed. What followed was the kind of parenthood Hector had been trying to practice for 4 years, in the margins of another life. The mornings without a rush. The evenings where dinner was actual food made slowly, instead of something reheated between emails. He took Mateo to the ROM on a Wednesday, because it was free for kids. They sat in front of the dinosaur exhibit for 40 minutes, and talked about extinction, and whether dinosaurs had known they were going to disappear, and whether it would be scarier to know or not know. "I think not knowing is better," Mateo said. Hector wasn't sure he agreed, but he wrote it down when he got home, in the small notebook he kept on the kitchen counter. There was joy in those weeks. There was also a rapidly emptying savings account. Hector had 3 months of severance. He had been careful with money, a holdover from watching his parents manage a household on a pipe fitter's wages. So there was more in reserve than most people in his position would have. But more than most is not enough forever, and the math had a deadline. He started doing financial consulting work through a small firm on a contract basis. The work was fine, the pay was inconsistent. He picked up a second contract doing bookkeeping for 3 small businesses in Scarborough: a bakery, a driving school, and a woman who imported handmade candles from Portugal. He worked in the evenings after Mateo was asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with spreadsheets open on his laptop, and the quiet hum of the refrigerator for company. One Saturday in January, he drove Mateo to a birthday party in North York and sat in the parking lot of a community center for 2 hours waiting, because he couldn't afford the gas to drive home and back. He didn't tell his son. That same week, the bakery stopped returning his calls. The candle importer paid him late, then stopped paying entirely. He sent 3 invoices. He didn't hear back. He sold his wife's old car, the one he'd been keeping in the parking lot, registered, insured, untouched, on a Thursday afternoon in February. He stood in the driveway and watched a stranger drive it away, and felt something specific and nameless close around his chest. Then he went inside, made soup, and picked up Mateo from school. When Mateo asked later where the blue car had gone, Hector said they didn't need 2 cars. "Can we get a dog instead?" Mateo asked. "Ask me again in the summer," Hector said. He meant it as a deflection, but Mateo wrote it on the kitchen calendar in green marker, June, ask about dog, and showed it to Hector with complete seriousness. That was the night Hector sat alone after putting his son to bed, and allowed himself, for the first time in months, to feel the full weight of where he actually was. He was 41 years old, he had no permanent job. He had a son who trusted him completely, which was both the most grounding thing in his life, and the thing that made every shortfall feel like a personal failure. He had 14 years of expertise that he had given to a company that had thanked him with 4 uses of the word, unfortunately. He sat with all of that for a while, then he made a list. He was always better with lists. Meridian Financial noticed Daniel was gone approximately 3 weeks before the market did. No, Hector. Hector was gone. And Meridian Financial noticed 3 weeks later, when a quarterly risk model flagged a variance that none of the remaining analysts could trace. They brought in a contractor. The contractor couldn't find it either. They updated the software. The variance persisted. The division head sent increasingly pointed emails. The contractor's fees doubled. The CEO of Meridian Financial was a woman named Audra Kendall. She had grown up in Calgary, studied economics at Queen's, done her MBA in London, and returned to Canada to build a career that most of her graduating class had considered mathematically unlikely. She was 47, unmarried by choice and known inside the industry for two things: a complete absence of small talk and an extraordinary instinct for risk. She was not, by her own description, a people person. She was precise. She trusted systems more than she trusted people, which she had always considered an advantage in finance. She could tell you the stress tolerances of a portfolio with the same ease another person might describe a recipe. She was respected. She was feared. She was, on most mornings, perfectly content with both. When the variance issue was brought to her attention in a Tuesday briefing, she asked 3 questions in rapid succession, received 3 unsatisfactory answers, and opened the personnel file for the model's original author. Hector Navarro, Risk Analytics Division. 14 years, let go in November. She read his file twice. Then she closed it and told herself the situation could be resolved internally. 6 days later, after 2 more failed attempts and a concerned call from a senior investor, she was less certain. She didn't send an email, she didn't call. She looked up his address in the employee records, still on file, not yet archived, and drove there herself on a Thursday evening, which was unusual enough that her assistant asked twice whether she needed something arranged. "No," Audra said, "I'll handle it." What she was not prepared for was Birchcliff. She had made assumptions, working from his salary history, about where Hector Navarro lived. The neighborhood she pulled up on her phone, as she drove east, along Kingston Road, revised those assumptions significantly. The building was a 3-story walk-up from the 1970s, the kind with metal staircases and buzzers that stuck. A grocery cart from a store 4 blocks away had somehow ended up near the entrance. The parking lot light was out. She sat in her car for a moment with the engine running. Then she got out. She rang the buzzer twice. The intercom produced a burst of static, then a child's voice, high, clear, mildly suspicious, asked who was there. She said she was looking for Hector Navarro. A pause. Then the same voice, slightly muffled, relaying this information to someone else in the apartment. The door buzzed open. The man who answered the door on the 2nd floor was not who she had been expecting. Which surprised her, because she hadn't consciously been expecting anything. He was wearing an old university sweatshirt with a faded logo, holding a dish towel, and there was a smear of what appeared to be tomato sauce on his forearm. He looked at her without surprise, which she found for some reason disorienting. Beside him, a boy of about 8 looked at her with large, direct eyes and said, "Are you from his work?" "I used to be," Hector said, glancing down at his son. "Why don't you go finish your homework, bud?" Mateo stayed exactly where he was. Audra introduced herself. Hector nodded, not the way people usually nodded when they heard her name, which was with some performance of recognition. He nodded the way a person nods when they've been expecting information and have now received it. "You'd better come in," he said. The apartment was small. Not in a neglected way, it was clean, organized, everything with a particular place. A corkboard beside the kitchen door was covered in Mateo's artwork, and a paper schedule with color-coded blocks. Books were stacked on both sides of a narrow hallway, a mix of what appeared to be financial texts and children's novels. A library book about wolves sat on top of a book about bond market volatility. Audra stood in the kitchen doorway, while Hector pulled out a chair at the table, not for her, but for himself, and looked at her with the specific patience of someone who has been through enough not to rush other people's difficult conversations. She explained the variance issue. She explained the contractor. She explained, with what she considered appropriate concision, why she was here. Hector listened without interrupting. Mateo had relocated himself to the far end of the kitchen table, and was doing something with a pencil and a piece of paper that was ostensibly homework, but was probably drawing. When she finished, Hector said, "The 3rd adjustment table in the Q3 recalibration. It was written to compensate for a data source we were phasing out, but nobody documented it properly. When the source dropped off, the model started reading the gap as variance. It isn't, it's an artifact." Silence. "It would take about 2 hours to patch," he added. "Maybe 3, if the access permissions have changed." Audra looked at him. "Will you come back to fix it?" "No," he said. She had not heard that word in approximately 6 years without it then being immediately retracted. She waited. "I'm not going back," Hector said. not angry, just clear. I gave that place 14 years, evenings, weeks, a lot of things I shouldn't have given away. I'm not doing it again. Matteo did not look up from his drawing. He had heard this kind of certainty from his father before. The model will continue producing false flags, Audra said. Yes, Hector agreed. It will. There was a pause that was neither hostile nor comfortable. Somewhere in the building, someone was playing music through a thin wall. You knew it was a bad build when you left, she said. It wasn't quite an accusation. I flagged it in 3 separate reports, he said. Nobody followed up. She drove home with that sentence in her head the entire way back down Kingston Road. She told herself she wouldn't go back. She sent a technical team instead. They identified the adjustment table and produced a correction that was, in her estimation, 70% correct. Enough to stop the alerts. Not enough to trust. Not if you understood the model the way Hector understood it. She approved the patch. She told herself it would hold. It held for 11 days. The second failure was worse. Not catastrophic, not publicly visible, but internally it produced the kind of quiet alarm that precedes larger problems the way a dropped glass precedes a fall. The senior investor called again. She asked pointed questions. Audra answered them with the particular economy of someone who is managing a situation, rather than explaining one, which is to say she told the truth, but not all of it. She went back to the apartment on a Saturday morning, this time without calling ahead. It was March now, and the temperature had risen enough that someone in the building had propped the front door open. She found Hector in the parking lot at the back, looking at the engine of a neighbor's car, while Matteo sat on the hood eating a clementine. Matteo saw her first. It's the work lady, he informed his father. Hector straightened up, wiped his hands on a rag. He did not look surprised. Still the adjustment table, he asked. The patch didn't hold. He nodded slowly. It wouldn't. There are 4 dependencies. Your team probably found one. How do you know what my team found? Because if they'd found 2, it would have held longer. She stood in the parking lot of a Birchcliff apartment building, in her good coat, and Hector Navarro looked at her with the same unhurried patience as the first time, and she had the specific and unfamiliar feeling of being the person who didn't fully understand the situation. I'm not asking you to come back full-time, she said. I'm asking for 1 week. Fix the model properly. Name your rate. I'll write it into whatever arrangement works for you. Hector looked at Matteo. Matteo looked back at him. 2 weeks, Matteo said. He had 1 clementine segment left and appeared to be saving it. Then I have March break. Hector said nothing for a moment. How much flexibility, he said finally, is there on the hours? He came back for 2 weeks. He came in at 9, and left at 3:30, which was a schedule that produced visible discomfort among people who had spent their careers treating late departure as evidence of commitment. He brought his own lunch. He didn't attend the optional team drinks on the Friday. He fixed the model with a thoroughness that the technical team described, in an internal email that somehow reached Audra, as almost annoying in how complete it is. He also found 3 other vulnerabilities in adjacent systems while he was there, documented them clearly, and left the documentation in a shared folder with a note that said simply, these should be addressed before Q2. Nobody had asked him to do that. He did it anyway. Audra read the documentation twice. Then she walked to the floor where he was working and found him packing up his laptop bag at 3:22 p.m. You found things we didn't know were broken, she said. Yes, he said, and you fixed them anyway, without being asked. It seemed like the right thing to do, he said. I built some of those systems. It felt strange to leave them wrong. She stood in the middle of the open plan office, and the few people who remained at their desks pretended not to be listening with varying degrees of success. I'd like you to stay, she said. Properly. Different arrangement than before. He looked at her. Different how? She told him. He told her he'd think about it. He thought about it for 9 days, which was longer than anyone at Meridian expected and shorter than Hector had originally intended. He was not, it turned out, the only one thinking. Audra Kendall had spent those 9 days doing something she rarely did, which was examining her own assumptions. She had reviewed the internal record of Hector's 14 years, the reports he'd flagged, the follow-ups that never came, the annual reviews that described him as reliable and detail-oriented, and never once mentioned that the division's best performance periods correlated almost entirely with the periods he'd had creative control of his models. She had spoken to 3 former colleagues of his, off the record, and heard variations on the same story: quiet, principled, never pushed, always delivered. She had also, in a way she found difficult to explain to herself, thought about the kitchen corkboard with its color-coded schedule, about the library book on wolves, sitting next to bond market volatility, about the specific quality of attention Matteo gave his father when Hector was speaking. Not the performance of attention that children produce when they're being watched, but the real kind, the kind that is built from long experiences of being listened to in return. She had been alone for a long time, not unhappily, mostly, but she had been alone. On the 9th evening, she drove to Birchcliff again. She had not called ahead. She was beginning to suspect that calling ahead with Hector Navarro produced a kind of prepared distance that she was not interested in navigating. It was raining. She had not dressed for rain. He opened the door before she knocked. She had buzzed, and Matteo had let her in, and he looked at her standing in the hallway in a wet coat, and didn't say anything about it, just stepped back to let her in. Matteo was in his room. The apartment was quieter. "You didn't have to come in person," he said. "I know," she said. She had brought something. She put it on the kitchen table, a manila folder, the kind she used for briefings. He looked at it without picking it up. "It's not a contract," said. He picked it up. Inside was a letter. 2 pages, handwritten. She had written it 3 times before she got it to something she could give to another person. It was not a business document. It was something closer to an admission of what the company had failed to do, and of what she personally had failed to see for years while running it. She had written that no employee under her leadership would again be evaluated purely on hours logged rather than work produced. She had written about flexible arrangements for parents, about proper attribution, about the specific and corrosive way organizations lose their best people, by treating loyalty as inexhaustible. She had written that she had reviewed his record, and that what she found there made her ashamed in a way that was useful, rather than performative. And at the bottom of the 2nd page, in the same handwriting, but with a slightly different pressure on the pen, the pressure of someone writing something they were less sure of, she had written that she had not come here only for the model. Hector read it slowly. He read it again. The rain picked up outside, tapping against the kitchen window. When he looked up, she was looking at the corkboard. "That's the March break schedule," he said. "I can see." She looked at the green marker entry. "Is he getting the dog?" "Probably," Hector said. "He's quite thorough." There was a pause. Outside the bedroom door, very quietly, small footsteps crossed from one side to the other and stopped. "I'm not the same person I was when I worked there," Hector said. "I want you to know that. Those 2 weeks, I could do the work, but I'm not going back to that version of things." "I know," Audra said. "That version is what I'm trying to change." "Are you the right person to change it?" She thought about that honestly. "I don't know, but I'm the one with the authority, so if it's going to happen, it has to be me." He nodded, slowly. "There's a school trip at the end of April," he said. "Matteo's class is going to the science center. I said I'd chaperone." "Okay," she said. "I'm not negotiating that away. I wasn't going to ask you to." Another silence, easier this time. "I'll come back," he said. "Different arrangement. What you proposed was close. I have some changes to the terms. Send them to me." "I will." She picked up her folder. He walked her to the door. In the hallway, she put her coat back on, and he watched her do it and said, before she reached the stairs, "Thank you for writing that instead of sending a form." She stopped. "I needed to write it," she said. "I think I'd needed to write it for a while." She went down the stairs. He stood in the doorway and listened until he heard the building door open and close. Behind him, Matteo's bedroom door eased open about 4 inches. "Is she your friend now?" Matteo asked. Hector considered this. "I think so," he said. "Maybe okay," Matteo said. "She seems serious, but serious isn't bad." He went back to bed. Hector stood in the hallway for another moment. Then he went to the kitchen, moved the folder to the counter, and made 2 mugs of chamomile tea. One for now, one because he'd offered, and then forgotten to ask. And sat at the table in the quiet of the apartment, and read the letter one more time. The terms he sent were reasonable. She accepted them without revision, which surprised him, and later she told him it was because she had written the letter, meaning every word of it, and accepting reasonable terms was simply the proof of that. He returned to Meridian in April. The arrangement was different in ways that were specific enough to matter: output-based hours, rather than time in seat, formal attribution on models he authored, an explicit protocol for escalating concerns that bypassed middle management, and the right to leave at 3:15, without it being marked anywhere. The first week, 2 other analysts asked him quietly how he'd managed it. He told them to document their concerns in writing and send them up the chain. They looked at him like he'd suggested something radical. Within 8 months, 3 other flexible arrangements had been negotiated in the division. Not because of Hector specifically, though he was part of it, because Audra Kendall had meant what she wrote. Change in institutions is slow, and often more partial than the people inside it hope for. But it had started, the direction was clear. Hector was there to see it, which mattered more to him than he would have said out loud. What grew between Hector and Audra afterward was not the clean sudden thing that stories tend to describe. She started texting him links to articles she thought he'd find interesting. Usually financial, occasionally not. He reciprocated. They had lunch twice, then a third time that ran 2 hours past what either had planned. She met Matteo properly, on a Saturday in May, when Hector brought him to a neighborhood market, and Audra appeared, because the market was 3 blocks from her place. And she happened to be, she admitted, later, with no convincing casualness, in the neighborhood. Matteo decided she was acceptable and communicated this in his usual way, which was to show her something he cared about. In this case, a book about deep-sea fish. She asked 3 questions about anglerfish, with what appeared to be genuine interest, which sealed it. Hector watched this from across the market stall and felt something loosening in his chest that he hadn't realized was still not odd. He had loved Celine completely. That was a fact, not a past tense. Grief doesn't actually move in a straight line, and anyone who tells you it does hasn't felt it. He still found birds on the windowsill and thought of her. He still made her soup, he probably always would. But there was space now that hadn't been there before. Room for something new, without requiring the old thing to diminish. He didn't rush it, neither did she. They were both, in their different ways, cautious people who had learned caution the hard way, and caution turned out to be something they held in common, without ever having to negotiate it. Matteo got the dog in June, a rescue greyhound, very large, very gentle, with a long face and an air of permanent mild bewilderment. Matteo named him Biscuit. Biscuit slept on Hector's feet. Biscuit regarded Audra with the same evaluative attention Matteo had used, decided she was fine, and eventually took to resting his long gray head on her knee whenever she visited. She started visiting more. On a Thursday evening in late October, 14 months after the day Hector had walked out of Meridian's glass doors, with a canvas bag and a cold thermos. He stood at the kitchen window watching Matteo in the backyard, throwing a tennis ball for Biscuit in the dark, the dog a pale streak against the October grass. Audra was at the kitchen table behind him, reading something on her laptop and eating the soup he'd made, the black bean soup that had taken him 2 years after Celine died to reconstruct from memory. She had asked for seconds. It was an ordinary evening. It was also, in the way that ordinary evenings sometimes are, the exact thing that had been missing for a long time. Hector turned away from the window and looked at the corkboard. New entries now, a school project deadline, a dentist appointment, a reminder about Biscuit's vet visit next Tuesday, and in the corner, a drawing Matteo had made last week of 4 figures, a tall man, a small boy, a large dog, and a woman with shoulder-length hair, and what appeared to be a very serious expression. He had not asked Matteo who the 4th figure was. He didn't need to. Outside, Matteo called Biscuit's name. The dog thundered back across the yard. The kitchen smelled soup and October rain through the cracked window. Audra turned a page. People survive through love, not power. He wasn't sure where he had first understood that. Whether Celine had taught him, or Matteo had, or whether it was simply what 14 years of invisible work and a cold thermos in an empty apartment had finally made undeniable. He suspected the answer was all of the above. The strongest people aren't the ones who never break. They're the ones who rebuild something warmer from the pieces. They're the ones who let someone else sit at the table, while the soup cools and say nothing. Because nothing needs to be said. Before we go, what would you choose? A career built on closed doors and long hours, or a life with enough room to share a bowl of soup on a Thursday night? Tell us in the comments. Share this with someone who's carrying too much alone. and subscribe to Resilience Tales. Because these are the stories that remind us, we're allowed to start over. Mateo came back inside, Biscuit at his heels, and the apartment filled with noise and cold air, and the specific chaos of a boy and a large dog returning from the dark, and Hector held the door open and let them both in, and that was enough. That was, for the first time in a long time, exactly enough.